Every evening, the widow lit a small lamp in the front window of her repair shop. The whole town knew about it. They knew she had lost her husband and little girl 3 winters ago. They knew she sat beside that lamp until the street went dark. They knew better than to ask why. Then one night, a lonely cowboy stopped outside her door. His coat was soaked from the rain. His hands were bruised from a day of fence work, and his eyes carried the look of a man who had been riding away from something for a long time. The widow opened the door, looked at him for a moment, and asked only one question: "Have you eaten?" He thought she was offering him supper. He did not know she was offering him the first place in years where he would not have to keep moving. Before I tell you why that cowboy never truly left her porch again, tell me where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Montana Territory, 1883. There's a particular kind of light that gas lamps throw against glass on a cold evening. A soft, low gold that doesn't reach far but reaches exactly far enough. And every soul in the town of Lark's Hollow had grown used to seeing it in the front window of Miriam Vale's mending shop, lit at dusk, burning steady until well past the hour when any reasonable shopkeeper would have gone to bed. They knew the story behind it, or most of it anyway. 3 winters back, a fever had come through that hadn't asked who deserved to survive it and who didn't. It had taken Miriam's husband Daniel first, quick and cruel, and 12 days later, it had taken their daughter Elsie, who was 6 years old, and had her father's stubborn chin and her mother's careful hands, the kind of hands that were already, at 6, learning to thread a needle because she'd watched her mother do it every evening of her short life. After that, Miriam kept the shop. She had to. A woman alone in 1883 either found a way to be useful or she found herself married off to whoever offered, and Miriam Vale had buried enough of her own choosing for one lifetime. She mended shirts, patched coats, turned worn saddle blankets inside out and stitched them sound again, hemmed curtains and quilts and the torn knees of children's trousers. And she did all of it well enough that the shop never wanted for work, even in a town that didn't always have much spare coin to spend on mending what it could simply do without. And every evening, without fail, she lit that lamp in the window. Nobody in Lark's Hollow asked her why anymore. They had asked, in the early months, gently, the way people ask when they're more curious than careful. She had answered once, simply, that Daniel used to read to Elsie by lamplight every night before bed, some old worn book of stories he'd half memorized, and that the lamp being lit felt like the house was still listening for them, even though the house, by then, was just the shop, and the listening was just Miriam, sitting alone with a needle in her hand, and the window glowing soft against the dark street outside. That was the whole answer. After that, the town simply understood. They knew better than to ask why a second time. Rowan Pike rode into Lark's Hollow on a wet afternoon in October, with a torn saddle blanket draped over his arm, and very little else to say about himself, which suited him fine, because talking about himself was not a habit he'd kept up in a long while. He was 39 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way men get from years of honest work, and he carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had decided, a long time back, that the less attention he drew, the better his life tended to go. He'd been a rodeo rider once, and a good one, fast enough and steady enough that his name had traveled further than most men's ever did in that line of work. There had been a season, years before, when crowds in 3 territories knew the name Rowan Pike before he'd even ridden out of the chute. Then there had been an accident. A young rider, a boy really, barely 17, had gone down hard in a race Rowan had pushed too close on, chasing a finish that hadn't been worth what it cost. The boy lived, but he never walked the same again, and Rowan had carried that the way some men carry a limp, invisible but permanent, in every step he took afterward. He stopped racing. He stopped staying anywhere crowds gathered. He took to ranch work instead, fence repair, cattle driving, barn building, the kind of labor that asked nothing of him but his hands and his silence. And he moved from job to job, the way a man moves when staying too long in one place starts to feel like a promise he isn't sure he's allowed to make. He found Miriam's shop because a rancher he was working for had pointed him toward it, said the widow Vale did the best mending in 3 counties and charged fair besides. Rowan walked in with the torn blanket and found a woman behind the counter who looked up at him once, assessed the tear with a glance, and told him the price and the day it would be ready, all in about 4 sentences, none of them wasted. Rowan appreciated that more than he could have explained. He was not a man who liked having to fill silence with conversation he didn't mean. 4 days, Miriam said. 4 days, Rowan agreed, and left, and that, by every appearance, should have been the whole of it. But Rowan stayed in Lark's Hollow longer than the work strictly required, taking on extra fence repair for a neighboring ranch, mostly because he found himself reluctant to ride on just yet, though he would not have called it that out loud even to himself. And in those extra days, he noticed the lamp. He noticed it the way a careful man notices most things, without remarking on it, just filing it away. Every evening, the same soft gold light in the same front window, and more than once, riding past late after a long day of work, he saw the shape of her still sitting there, needle moving, well past any hour a shop ought reasonably to stay open. He asked about it, eventually, the way a man asks when curiosity finally outweighs his usual reluctance to ask anything of anyone. Old Hollis Greer, who ran the general store and had buried 2 wives himself, and therefore considered himself something of an authority on grief, told him plainly, without much drama in the telling. Husband and daughter, same winter, fever, lamps been lit every night since. Folks don't ask why anymore. Rowan didn't ask why either. He understood it immediately, in a way that surprised him a little. He understood what it was to carry something you couldn't put down and didn't want anyone trying to take from you, even out of kindness. He had his own version of that, riding a horse instead of lighting a lamp, but the shape of the thing, the not wanting to let go, even when letting go might have been easier, that he recognized like a language he already spoke. The night everything started to shift was a wet, cold one in early November. Rowan was riding back from the ranch where he'd been working fence all day, half-soaked and tired in the particular bone-deep way that comes after 12 hours outdoors in weather that didn't care whether a man was working or not, and he passed the mending shop the way he had most evenings, expecting the same soft gold square of light in the window. It wasn't there. He slowed his horse without quite deciding to. The street was dark, where it usually wasn't. He sat there a moment longer than made sense for a man who told himself it wasn't his business, and then he turned his horse and rode the short distance to Hollis Greer's store instead of riding on toward the bunkhouse where he was staying. "Her lamp isn't lit," he said, when Hollis came to the door, mildly surprised to find Rowan Pike standing there at that hour. Someone ought to check on her. He didn't go in himself. He didn't knock on Miriam's door, didn't position himself as the man who'd come to the rescue. He simply said what he'd noticed to someone who had the standing to act on it, and then he rode on to the bunkhouse, because that was as far as he believed it was his place to go. It turned out Miriam had taken a fever herself that week, nothing as severe as the one that had taken Daniel and Elsie, but enough to lay her flat for 2 days with a head too heavy to lift and hands too unsteady to trust with a needle, let alone a match for the lamp. Hollis's wife sat with her until it broke, brought broth and cool cloths, the ordinary mercy of small towns that don't always say much, but show up when it counts. When Miriam was well enough to be back behind her counter, Hollis mentioned, almost in passing, that it had been the Pike fellow who'd noticed first, who'd come knocking on his door at near dark, asking someone to check on her because her window had gone dark too. Miriam said nothing in response beyond a quiet thank you to Hollis. But something in how she looked at Rowan the next time he came through her door with a button missing from a coat sleeve this time, a small enough repair that didn't quite explain the visit, was different than it had been before. Softer, maybe. Or just more curious. Winter settled in hard that year, the way Montana winters do, and along with the cold came Silas Crow. Silas ran the largest freight operation in 3 counties, wagons and contracts, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from controlling something most people couldn't manage without. He'd been bringing Miriam mending business for over a year. Canvas tarps that tore, harness leather that split, the wear and tear of a freight outfit running through rough country, and it had always, until that winter, been straightforward business between them. That December, Silas brought in a stack of torn canvas covers, 6 of them, real work, the kind that would keep Miriam's hands busy for the better part of a week. When he came to collect them, finished and folded and ready, he counted out payment for half of what they'd agreed. "Business has been slow," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, setting the coins on the counter like the matter was already settled. A widow with a needle shouldn't argue with a man who brings half this town its freight. Miriam did not raise her voice. She had buried a husband and a daughter. She was not about to be frightened by a man shorting her on canvas work. "We agreed on a price, Mr. Crow," she said, "and I delivered exactly what was asked. I expect the rest of what's owed." Silas's expression didn't change much, but something in it cooled. "Winter's long," he said, turning toward the door. "People need work. We'll see how proud you are when the orders stop coming." Rowan was just stepping through the door as Silas was stepping out, close enough to have heard the last of it. He didn't grab the man's arm. He didn't raise his voice either. He simply stood there, solid and unhurried in the doorway, and asked, plain and even, "Everything all right, Mrs. Vale?" Silas looked at him, sized him up the way men like Silas size up anyone who might cost them something, and seemed to decide, on instinct more than information, that this was not a man worth testing further that particular evening. He left without another word, though the threat in his earlier sentence stayed hanging in the shop long after the door had shut behind him. That evening, after the shop had gone quiet, Miriam looked at Rowan properly for what felt like the first time, not at the work he'd brought her, not at his name or his history, but at the man himself. He looked tired in a way that went past the day's labor. His hands, she noticed, were chapped and scraped from fence wire, and there was mud dried along one boot that told her exactly how long he'd been outdoors that day. She asked the only question that felt honest in that moment. "Have you eaten?" Rowan blinked, caught off guard, in a way that surprised him more than it should have. People asked him for plenty of things. Fence work, cattle drives, a strong arm when something heavy needed moving. Nobody, in longer than he cared to count, had asked him something that small, that plain, that had nothing at all to do with what he could do for them. "No, ma'am," he admitted. "Sit down," Miriam said, already moving toward the back room where she kept a small stove. "I have stew, and there's bread that won't keep past tomorrow anyway." He sat. She set a bowl in front of him, biscuits, strong coffee, nothing fancy, nothing that announced itself as more than what it was. Neither of them spoke much through the meal. Rowan ate slowly, the way a man eats when he's not in any particular hurry to leave a table, and Miriam sat across from him with her own cup of coffee, watching the lamp in the front window throw its familiar gold light across the floor between them. And the quiet between the two of them did not feel empty. It felt, for the first time in a long while for either of them, like company. The weeks that followed found Rowan returning to that shop with a frequency that had less to do with torn coats than either of them admitted out loud. Sometimes there was a real repair, a split harness strap, a porch step that had finally given way under one too many winters. Sometimes there wasn't much of an excuse at all, beyond a wagon load of firewood he claimed had simply been extra, dropped at her back door because he'd noticed, on a ride past, that her woodpile had gotten low. Miriam never told him to stay. She didn't need to. She set a place at the table without making a show of it, and he sat without making a show of accepting. And slowly, without either of them naming what was happening, a rhythm formed between them that neither one was in any hurry to disturb. One evening, with the lamp burning low and the stew long finished, Miriam told him about Daniel and the book of stories he used to read to Elsie. How the girl would beg for one more page, even half asleep. How Daniel's voice would go soft and slow in the last lines, like he was easing her toward sleep on purpose, with the rhythm of it. Rowan didn't offer comfort. He didn't tell her it would get easier, or that they were in a better place, or any of the things people say when they don't know what else to say. He just sat there beside her, quiet, present, letting the memory exist in the room without trying to soften it or rush her past it. Miriam, who had spent 3 winters being comforted at by people who meant well but never quite landed right, found that his silence did more for her than any of their careful words ever had. There came an evening, not long after, when Miriam stood at the counter at dusk with the match in her hand and simply could not bring herself to strike it. Some nights the weight of the ritual was heavier than others, and that night it sat on her chest like a stone. Rowan, sitting near the stove, watched her stand there a long moment. "I can go," he said quietly, "or I can sit with you while you do it. Whichever you want." Miriam looked at the lamp, then at him. "Sit," she said. It was a small word. It did not feel small. The threat from Silas Crow did not stay quiet for long. Through that winter, fewer wagons stopped outside Miriam's shop. A few regular customers found reasons to take their mending elsewhere, the kind of reasons people give when the real reason is fear of crossing a man who controls half the freight contracts in the county. Miriam kept her chin level through all of it, the way she'd learned to keep it level through worse, but Rowan saw what it cost her, the careful counting of coins at week's end, the longer hours she sat alone at her bench because there was less coming in and more time, suddenly, to fill. Then one night, someone got into the back of the shop and ruined a stack of finished canvas covers, soaked through and torn beyond repair, work that represented days of careful labor and the better part of that month's income. Nothing was stolen. Nothing else was touched. It didn't need to be more than what it was to say exactly what it was meant to say. Miriam stood in that back room the next morning, looking at the ruined canvas, and for the first time since Rowan had known her, something in her cracked open just slightly. "I kept this place alive after I buried them," she said, her voice steady, but her hands not quite. "I will not lose it, because one man thinks a widow ought to bow her head." Rowan did not tell her he'd handle it. He understood by then that handling it for her would have undone something important in what they'd built together. Instead, he rode to Hollis Greer's store and told him plainly what had happened, and Hollis, who had a long memory for who had quietly mended his children's coats for free during hard winters past, did not need much convincing to spread the word. What followed was not loud. There was no town meeting, no speeches. There was simply, over the following days, a steady stream of customers coming through Miriam's door with work that hadn't been there the week before. Mrs. Albee brought 3 quilts that had been sitting unmended for a year. The schoolteacher brought a stack of children's coats, old ranch hands who'd never once needed a thing mended in their lives, suddenly found shirts that wanted patching. It wasn't charity, and everyone involved was careful to make sure it didn't look or feel like charity. It was simply a town quietly deciding, one piece of work at a time, whose side it was standing on. Silas Crow came by once more, near the end of that winter, his patience for being quietly outmaneuvered apparently worn thin. He came into the shop with the same easy confidence he'd always carried, told Miriam plainly that her business with him was finished unless she agreed to work exclusively under his contracts, on his terms, which meant, in practice, on whatever terms he decided to set. Rowan was in the room. He did not step forward. He did not need to, not yet. Miriam set down the work in her hands and looked at Silas Crow with the particular steadiness of a woman who had already survived the worst thing life had to offer her. "I have buried more than you could ever frighten out of me, Mr. Crow," she said. "This shop stayed open when my whole world went dark. You do not get to be the thing that closes it." Silas's jaw tightened. He took half a step toward the counter, more out of frustration than any clear intention, and that was the only moment Rowan moved at all, stepping forward, not raising his voice, not raising a hand, simply placing himself, calm and immovable, between the counter and the man. "You heard the lady," he said. Silas looked at him a long moment, weighed whatever he thought he might gain against whatever he was fairly certain he'd lose, and left without another word. He did not come back to that shop again. Within the year, word traveled that 2 other freight men had set up in the county willing to pay fair rates, and Silas Crow's particular grip on Lark's Hollow loosened a good deal more than he'd ever admit out loud. By the time spring was easing the snow off the hills, Rowan had been offered something he hadn't sought out at all: a standing position at a ranch just outside town, year-round work. The kind of offer that meant, for the first time in a long while, he didn't have to ride on when the season's work ran out. He didn't tell Miriam right away. Staying had always frightened him more than leaving ever had, because leaving asked nothing of him, while staying meant choosing something, and choosing something meant it could be taken from him the way so much else already had been. But Miriam noticed his hesitation the way she noticed most things, quietly, without pressing. One morning, he came into the shop with no torn coat, no excuse of firewood or fence work, just his hat in his hands, the way a man holds something when he's nervous about what he's about to say. "I've spent years leaving before a place could ask me to stay," he said, "but this place already has." Miriam set down the needle in her hand and waited. "I'd like to stay, Miriam," he said, "not as a boarder, not as a man passing through, as your husband, if you'll have me." She did not cry right away. She set the work down on the bench, slowly, the way she set down everything, with care, and looked at him a long moment. "Then stay," she said. That evening, as dusk settled over Lark's Hollow, Miriam stood at the counter with the match in her hand, the same way she had 100 evenings before. But this time, she paused and looked over at Rowan, sitting near the stove, the way he had so many evenings since that first bowl of stew. "Would you light it tonight?" she asked. It was not a small question, though it sounded like one. That lamp had burned for Daniel and for Elsie for 3 long winters, lit by Miriam's hand alone, a private vigil nobody else had ever been asked to share. Asking Rowan to light it was not asking him to replace what had been lost. It was asking him to sit beside it, the way he'd already learned to sit beside her grief without trying to take it from her. Rowan struck the match. The lamp caught, glowing soft and gold against the front window the way it always had, the way it would keep doing for years to come. Except now, there were 2 chairs pulled up near it instead of 1. They sat on the porch that night, the lamp burning behind them in the window, and neither one of them said very much, because by then they'd learned that some of the most important things between 2 people don't need saying at all. A year later, on a quiet afternoon, a small boy from down the road brought in a torn jacket for mending, and while Miriam worked the needle, Rowan carried in another load of firewood from the wagon outside, and the lamp burned in the window the same way it always had. Nothing about Daniel or Elsie had been erased. Their memory still lived in that small flame every single evening. But it no longer burned for an empty room. It burned for a house that had, slowly and carefully, learned how to be full again. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with grand speeches or daring rescues. Sometimes it arrives with a question as plain as, "Have you eaten?" asked by someone who has finally noticed you're hungry in more ways than one. Rowan Pike spent years riding away from anywhere that might ask him to stay, because staying had always felt like a promise he wasn't sure he was allowed to make. Miriam Vale spent 3 winters keeping a lamp lit so the people she loved would never feel forgotten. And in the end, it was a torn saddle blanket and a bowl of stew that brought them both, finally, to the same quiet porch, in the same warm light, no longer alone. Thank you for riding with me today. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you were here. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Until next time, keep riding.